The salt-heavy wind carried the stench of rotting fish and unwashed bodies through the crowded port of Devil's Cove, a lawless haven where pirates, smugglers, and the desperate converged under the indifferent gaze of a blood-red sunset. Wooden platforms lined the dock, and upon one stood a young woman, her belly swollen with child, her wrists bound with fraying rope. Ilara's dark hair hung in matted tangles around her pale face, her eyes downcast, as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the gathering crowd. She trembled, not from the evening chill that crept off the Caribbean waters, but from the crushing weight of betrayal that had brought her to this moment. Her own mother had sold her. The words still echoed in Ilara's mind, spoken with cold finality 3 days prior in their cramped boarding house. "You're a burden I can no longer bear, girl. That bastard in your belly will fetch a price. Someone will pay for a young body, even one ruined as yours." Now, as rough hands grabbed at her arms and vulgar comments filled the air, Ilara fought the urge to collapse. The baby moved within her, a flutter of life that reminded her she wasn't entirely alone, though she might as well have been. 20 silver pieces!" shouted a gap-toothed merchant with breath like spoiled rum. 25! countered a ship's cook, his eyes lingering on her with hunger that made her skin crawl. The auctioneer grinned, revealing blackened teeth. "Come now, gentlemen. She's young, strong enough for work. And the whelp will be born soon, think of it. 2 for the price of 1. Laughter rippled through the crowd, each chuckle another nail in Ilara's coffin of dignity. She closed her eyes, willing herself to disappear, to wake from this nightmare aboard the ship that had carried her here, where her mother had handed her over to the slavers like spoiled cargo. Then silence fell. The crowd parted like waves before a ship's bow, and Ilara felt the shift in the air before she saw him. When she finally lifted her gaze, her breath caught. He was tall, towering over most men present, with broad shoulders wrapped in a weathered black coat that had seen countless storms. A tricorn hat shadowed his face, but she could make out a strong jaw, darkened by days-old stubble, and eyes the color of stormy seas that seemed to pierce through every pretense, every lie, every defense she'd built around her breaking heart. Captain Nathaniel Drake. Even Ilara, sheltered as she'd been before her fall from grace, had heard whispers of his name. The Lonely Reaper, they called him. A pirate who sailed without crew beyond his most trusted few, who took no prisoners and showed no mercy. His ship, the Crimson Wraith, was said to be crewed by ghosts. 500 silver pieces, his voice cut through the silence like a blade, deep, rough, carrying the weight of absolute authority. The auctioneer's jaw dropped. "Captain Drake, surely you just—" 500, Nathaniel repeated, his gaze never leaving Ilara's face. "And if any man here wishes to challenge my bid, step forward now." No one moved. No one dared. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was worse somehow than being bought by the merchant or the cook. This was the Lonely Reaper, a man whose legend was written in blood across Caribbean waters. What use could he possibly have for a pregnant woman? The transaction completed swiftly. Coins exchanged hands, and before Ilara could process what was happening, Captain Drake had cut her bindings with a knife that gleamed in the dying light. His touch was surprisingly gentle, as he steadied her when she swayed. "Can you walk?" His voice, closer now, held an unexpected softness beneath its gravelly texture. She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then come. The Wraith is anchored in the deep harbor." As they walked through the parting crowd, Ilara felt every eye upon her, heard every whispered speculation. The Lonely Reaper had bought himself a woman, a pregnant one at that. The taverns would buzz with theories for weeks. The longboat that carried them to his ship rocked gently on darkening waters. 2 men rowed in silence, their faces weathered maps of hard lives at sea. Nathaniel sat across from her, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. When they reached the Crimson Wraith, Ilara's breath caught again. The ship was magnificent, a 3-masted brigantine with sails the color of dried blood, her hull painted black as midnight. Lanterns swung from the rigging, casting dancing shadows across the deck. Nathaniel helped her aboard with surprising care, his large hand steady at her elbow. The few crew members present, she counted only 5, watched with curiosity but said nothing. "Bring fresh water and food to my cabin," Nathaniel ordered one of them before turning to Ilara. "Follow me." His cabin was spacious, dominated by a massive oak desk covered in maps and charts. A hammock swung in one corner, and shelves lined with books and strange artifacts covered the walls. Through the stern windows, she could see the lights of Devil's Cove growing distant. Nathaniel removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair streaked with premature grey. In the lamplight she could see his face clearly for the first time, handsome in a rugged way, with a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, and those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to see too much. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a cushioned chair. "You're safe now." Ilara lowered herself carefully, her hands instinctively cradling her belly. "Safe? I'm a slave on a pirate ship." "You're no slave." Nathaniel poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and handed it to her. "I don't keep slaves. Never have." She took the cup with trembling hands, studying him warily. "Then why did you buy me?" He was silent for a long moment, turning to gaze out the windows at the darkening sea. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old grief. "Because I know what it is to be sold by those who should protect you. Because I saw in your eyes what I once felt, that terrible moment when you realize you're utterly alone in this world." He turned back to face her. "And because no woman, especially one carrying life, should be treated as cargo." Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, the first she'd allowed herself since her mother's betrayal. They spilled down her cheeks, unchecked. Nathaniel's expression softened further. He pulled up a chair and sat across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. "What's your name?" "Ilara," she whispered. "Ilara Thorne." "Well, Ilara Thorne, you'll have a cabin of your own. You'll eat with us, and when your time comes, we have a surgeon aboard who's delivered more babies than he cares to count. You'll work if you wish, or rest if you need, but you're not property, not anymore." "I don't understand," Ilara said, wiping at her tears. "Why would you do this?" Nathaniel stood and moved to his desk, pulling out a worn leather journal. He opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon and held it so she could see. Inside was a sketch, a woman's face, delicate and beautiful, with kind eyes. "Her name was Catherine," he said quietly. 20 years ago, she was sold by her father to settle gambling debts. I was the captain's cabin boy aboard the merchant vessel that transported her. I was barely 14, and I fell in love with her kindness, the way she sang despite her tears." His jaw tightened. "She was pregnant too, the captain who'd bought her. He wasn't kind. She threw herself overboard one night during a storm. I tried to save her. I failed." The silence that followed was heavy with old pain. "I swore that night," Nathaniel continued, closing the journal, "that if I ever had the power to prevent such suffering, I would. I became a pirate not for gold, Ilara, but for freedom. Mine and anyone else's I could grant it to." Ilara looked at this fearsome pirate captain with new eyes. "The Lonely Reaper," she said softly. "They say you're heartless." A bitter smile crossed his face. "It's easier to survive in this world if people fear you. Fear keeps you alive longer than kindness." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young man entered carrying a tray laden with bread, cheese, dried fruit, and salted fish. His eyes widened when he saw Ilara. "Set it on the desk, James," Nathaniel said. When they were alone again, Nathaniel gestured to the food. "Eat. You need your strength." As Ilara ate, the first decent meal she'd had in days, Nathaniel busied himself with his maps, giving her space to process everything. The Crimson Wraith creaked and swayed beneath them, a surprisingly soothing rhythm. Finally, Nathaniel showed her to a small cabin next to his. It was simple but clean, with a proper bed, a porthole looking out to sea, and a trunk for belongings she didn't have. "Rest," he said from the doorway. "Tomorrow we sail for Nassau. There's a woman there, runs an inn, who might have clothes more suitable for you." He hesitated. "Sleep well, Ilara." As his footsteps faded down the passageway, Ilara sank onto the bed and pressed her hand to her belly. "We're safe," she whispered to her unborn child. "I don't know how, but we're safe." Outside, the Caribbean night wrapped around the Crimson Wraith like a dark embrace, and for the first time since her mother's betrayal, Ilara slept without nightmares. Chapter 2. The tempest within dawn broke over Nassau 3 days later. Painting the harbour in shades of gold and coral, Ilara stood at the ship's rail, watching the bustling port come to life. In the short time aboard the Wraith, she'd begun to understand why Nathaniel was called the Lonely Reaper. His crew was indeed small, just 7 men who spoke little but worked with practiced efficiency. Yet they'd been kind to her in their rough way. Old Marcus, the surgeon, had examined her and declared both mother and child healthy. Young James brought her meals with shy smiles. Even gruff Hawkins, the quartermaster, had nodded respectfully when they passed. But it was Nathaniel who occupied her thoughts most. He'd kept his distance, respectful to a fault, yet she often caught him watching her with those storm-grey eyes, an expression on his face she couldn't quite decipher. Concern, certainly, but something else too. Something that made her heart beat a little faster. "Ready?" His voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him dressed in clean clothes, his coat brushed free of salt spray. He'd trimmed his beard, and she realized with a start how handsome he truly was. "Yes," she said, smoothing her worn dress self-consciously. Nassau was a revelation. Unlike Devil's Cove, it thrummed with a strange kind of order. Pirates and merchants coexisted in wary peace, governed by codes and customs that kept outright chaos at bay. Nathaniel guided her through crowded streets with a protective hand near her elbow, never quite touching but always ready to steady her. The inn he'd mentioned, the Silver Mermaid, was run by a formidable woman named Margaret, whose silver-streaked hair was bound in a tight bun and whose sharp eyes missed nothing. "Nate Drake," she said, pulling Nathaniel into a brief, fierce hug. "It's been too long, you stubborn fool." Her gaze shifted to Ilara and her expression softened. "And who's this flower you've brought me?" "This is Ilara," Nathaniel said. "She needs clothes, Margaret, and anything else she might require." Margaret's eyes flicked to Ilara's belly, then back to Nathaniel's face, and understanding bloomed there. "Come with me, dear. We'll get you sorted." As Margaret led her upstairs, Ilara glanced back to see Nathaniel watching them go, that unreadable expression on his face again. The next hour was a whirlwind. Margaret provided several dresses, simpler than what Ilara had worn in her former life, but well made and comfortable. There were undergarments, a warm shawl, even a pair of sturdy boots. "He's a good man," Margaret said, as she helped Ilara into a deep blue dress that complemented her dark hair. "Broken, perhaps, but good. Whatever story brought you to him, know that you're safe in his care." "You've known him long?" Ilara asked. 20 years, Margaret replied, pinning up Ilara's hair. "I knew him when he was still that traumatized cabin boy. I was working a merchant vessel then, cooking for the crew. I saw what happened with Catherine, saw how it changed him." She paused, meeting Ilara's eyes in the mirror. "He's never brought a woman aboard his ship before, not in all these years. You must mean something to him, whether he's admitted it to himself or not." Ilara's cheeks flushed. "He pities me, nothing more." "Perhaps," Margaret said with a knowing smile. "Or perhaps not." When they returned downstairs, Nathaniel was deep in conversation with a weathered man whose military bearing spoke of naval service, now turned pirate. They fell silent as Ilara approached. Nathaniel's eyes widened slightly, taking in her transformation. "You look," he cleared his throat. "That color suits you." That night, back aboard the Wraith, Nathaniel invited her to dine with him in his cabin. The meal was simple but good. Fresh fish Marcus had caught that morning, bread from Margaret's ovens, and wine Nathaniel poured sparingly. "Tell me about your life before," Nathaniel said, his voice gentle, "if you wish to speak of it." Ilara hesitated, then began. She told him of her father, a merchant who died when she was 16, leaving debts that swallowed everything. Of her mother's growing bitterness and desperation. Of Thomas, the clerk who'd promised to marry her, then disappeared when she revealed her pregnancy. "My mother said I'd shamed her," Ilara said, her voice breaking, "that I was worthless now. When she told me she'd sold me, she looked relieved." Nathaniel's hand clenched around his cup. "The cruelest betrayals come from those who should love us most." "Your parents?" Ilara asked softly. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "My father was a drunk who sold me to a merchant captain for rum money when I was 12. I never knew my mother, She died birthing me, or so I was told. He drained his cup. I spent 2 years as that captain's whipping boy before I escaped during a port stop, worked my way up from nothing, took this ship from a cruel bastard who didn't deserve her, and swore I'd never answer to anyone again. Is that when you became the Lonely Reaper? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. That name came later, after I'd sunk enough Navy vessels and freed enough slaves that they needed something fearsome to call me. The lonely part, that's accurate enough. It's hard to trust people when you've been betrayed by the ones meant to protect you. Yet you've trusted me, Ilara said. A stranger. His eyes met hers, and the intensity there made her breath catch. You're not a stranger anymore. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither seemed ready to name. Then the ship gave a sudden lurch, and Nathaniel was on his feet, steadying her. "Storm coming," he said, listening to the wind's changing song. A bad one, by the sound. Within the hour, the Caribbean had transformed from peaceful to furious. Lightning split the sky as waves crashed over the Wraith's deck. Nathaniel ordered Ilara to remain in her cabin, but she could hear the crew shouting, the groaning of the ship's timbers, the howling wind. Then came a tremendous crack, the mainmast splitting under the storm's fury. Ilara grabbed the doorframe as the ship listed sharply. Water poured down the passageway. Above, she heard Nathaniel's voice roaring orders, heard the panic in his crew's responses. Something in her refused to cower while others fought for their lives. Gripping the walls, she made her way to the deck. The scene was chaos. The broken mast had crashed across the deck, pinning Marcus beneath its weight. Waves swept over the rails, threatening to wash them all into the churning sea. Nathaniel and 3 others fought to secure the rigging, while James tried desperately to free the surgeon. Without thinking, Ilara grabbed a length of rope and helped James, adding her strength to his. Together, they created enough leverage for Marcus to drag himself free just as another wave hit. "Get below," Nathaniel shouted when he saw her, but there was no time. The storm raged for hours. Ilara worked alongside the crew, bailing water, securing cargo, doing whatever needed doing. Her hands bled, her muscles screamed, but she didn't stop. Finally, as dawn broke, the storm exhausted itself. The Wraith was battered but afloat, her crew exhausted but alive. Nathaniel found Ilara collapsed against the mizzenmast, soaked and shivering. He knelt beside her, his face etched with something between fury and awe. "You could have died," he said roughly. "You and the child both." "So could you," she shot back, too tired to guard her words. "I wasn't going to hide while you fought alone." His expression shifted, and suddenly his hand was on her cheek, his thumb brushing away seawater and tears. "You stubborn, brave, foolish woman." Their faces were inches apart. Ilara could see gold flecks in his grey eyes, smell the salt and storm on his skin. "Nathaniel," she whispered. But he pulled away, standing abruptly. "You need rest. We both do." As he helped her to her cabin, Ilara realized something had changed between them. The distance he'd maintained so carefully had cracked, like the mainmast in the storm, and she wasn't sure either of them could repair it, or if they even wanted to. Chapter 3. Treasure of the Heart. The Crimson Wraith limped into Tortuga for repairs a week after the storm. The damage was extensive. The mainmast needed replacing, several sails were torn beyond repair, and the hull had taken on water that required the attention of skilled shipwrights. Ilara had noticed the change in Nathaniel since the storm. He no longer kept his careful distance. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. He taught her to read the stars for navigation, showed her his charts and the routes he'd sailed. She, in turn, shared memories of her father teaching her about merchants and trade, knowledge Nathaniel found surprisingly useful. But there were also the moments they didn't speak of, his hand lingering on hers when passing a cup of coffee, the way his eyes followed her across the deck, how she'd wake from dreams of grey eyes and storm-tossed seas with her heart racing. Tortuga was wilder than Nassau, a true pirate haven where law meant nothing and every man carried at least 2 weapons. Nathaniel rarely left her side when they went ashore, his protective presence keeping the rougher elements at bay. It was in a tavern called the Drunken Parrot that they overheard the conversation that would change everything. Spanish treasure galleon, the Santa Maria. a grizzled pirate was saying to his companions. Went down in a hurricane 20 years back, somewhere off the Windward Passage. They say it carried the ransom of a king, gold, jewels, religious artifacts, never been found. Nathaniel's hand tightened on his mug. 20 years, Ilara said softly, reading his expression. When Catherine died. He nodded slowly. The ship that was transporting her, it was the Santa Maria. The captain had bought her in Havana with Spanish gold. When she went overboard, I dove after her. I saw the ship breaking apart above us, saw the cargo spilling into the deep. His voice was distant, lost in memory. I barely made it to the surface alive. I always assumed the treasure was lost to the depths. But, Ilara prompted, but hurricanes shift things. Storms dredge up what was buried. His eyes met hers. Marcus has been mapping current patterns for years. If the Santa Maria broke up where I remember, and if the recent storms have shifted the sandbars, you could find it, she finished. Over the next week, as the Wraith underwent repairs, Nathaniel pored over charts with Marcus, calculating currents and tides. Ilara watched him work, saw the old pain resurface, but also something new. Purpose, perhaps, or closure. If we find it, he said one evening, looking up from his charts, half goes to the crew, a quarter to you and the baby, enough to set you up anywhere you choose, to live well without depending on anyone. Ilara's throat tightened. And the rest? Margaret's been wanting to expand the Silver Mermaid, maybe create a place where women escaping bad situations can find shelter. Catherine would have liked that. You're a good man, Nathaniel Drake, Ilara said softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and what she saw in his face made her heart skip. You make me want to be. The Wraith set sail 2 days later, fully repaired and provisioned. Nathaniel navigated to the coordinates he remembered, then adjusted based on Marcus's calculations. They dropped anchor in crystal-clear waters above a reef system, and Nathaniel prepared to dive. Let me come with you, Ilara said. Absolutely not. You're 8 months pregnant, woman. Then take someone, don't dive alone. His expression softened. Worried about me, are you? Yes, she said simply, without embarrassment. I am. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of what had been growing since the storm. Nathaniel reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers gentle. I'll take James, he said quietly. But I'm coming back, Ilara, I promise you that. She watched from the rail as he and James dove with weighted ropes to guide them down. The wait was agony. 10 minutes, 20, 30. The crew grew restless, murmuring about currents and air. Then, breaking the surface, Nathaniel and James, both gasping, both empty-handed. Ilara's heart sank as they climbed aboard. Nothing. Nathaniel shook water from his eyes, and then he smiled, the first true smile she'd seen from him. Nothing? We found everything. The Santa Maria is down there, mostly intact, wedged in a canyon. More gold than I've ever seen, artifacts, chests of jewels. He grabbed her hands. We found it, Ilara, we actually found it. The crew erupted in cheers, but Ilara only had eyes for Nathaniel. His joy was infectious, transforming his usually serious face into something boyish and free. Over the next 2 days they worked to bring up the treasure. It was back-breaking labor, even with pulleys and ropes. Chest after chest came up, each one heavier than the last. Gold doubloons, silver pieces of 8, emeralds, rubies, religious icons crafted in precious metals and gems. But there was something else too. Among the cargo, Nathaniel found a small wooden box, water-damaged but intact. Inside was a journal, the captain's log of the Santa Maria. That night in his cabin, Nathaniel read it by lamplight while Ilara sat nearby, mending a shirt. Listen to this, he said suddenly, his voice strange. He read aloud. The woman Catherine continues to weep. She claims the child she carries is a blessing, not a curse despite her circumstances. She asks constantly if there's a way to send word to the cabin boy, the Drake lad who showed her kindness. She says if anything happens to her, she wants him to know the baby was his. The journal slipped from Nathaniel's hands. His, she said, a The baby was mine. Ilara's eyes widened. You and Catherine? Nothing happened between us, Nathaniel said hoarsely. I was 14, she was 16, we talked, that's all. She was kind to me when no one else was. I always thought the child was the captain's from some earlier assault. His hands shook as he picked up the journal again. She loved me. She was carrying my child, and I didn't know. All these years I didn't know. Ilara moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his trembling hands in hers. You were a boy. There was nothing you could have done. I could have saved her, he whispered. I should have. No. Ilara's voice was firm. You tried. You nearly died trying. Nathaniel, you can't carry that guilt anymore. Catherine wouldn't want you to. He looked at her then, his eyes wet with tears he'd held back for 2 decades. I've been alone so long, Ilara. I built these walls to keep everyone out, to never feel that pain again. And then you came along, and every wall I built started crumbling. Maybe walls aren't meant to last forever, she said softly. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheekbones. I'm falling in love with you. I've been falling since the moment I saw you on that platform. So brave despite your fear. And I'm terrified because everyone I've ever loved has been taken from me. I'm not going anywhere, Ilara whispered. I promise you, Nathaniel, I'm not going anywhere. When he kissed her, it was gentle and sweet, and tasted of salt and redemption. Ilara felt her own walls crumbling, the ones she'd built against a world that had hurt her. In Nathaniel's arms, she felt something she'd thought lost forever, hope. They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other as the wraith rocked gently beneath them, as stars wheeled overhead through the cabin windows, as the Caribbean night wrapped them in its warm embrace. The treasure was real, but Ilara knew they'd both found something far more valuable. Chapter 4. Safe Harbor. The baby came 3 weeks later, on a moonlit night off the coast of Jamaica. Ilara's labor was long but not complicated, and when dawn broke, a healthy boy entered the world with a lusty cry that made the crew cheer from the deck above. Nathaniel held his son not by blood but by choice, with trembling hands, his grey eyes wet with wonder. Thomas, Ilara said, looking up at him from the bed where she lay exhausted and radiant. After my father, and Drake as a surname if you'll have us. If I'll have you, Nathaniel's voice broke. Ilara, you're the greatest treasure I've ever found. You and this boy. He carefully placed Thomas in her arms and knelt beside the bed. Marry me, not because you need protection or security, but because I love you, because I can't imagine my life without you in it. Yes, she said through happy tears. Yes, Nathaniel. Yes. They were married a week later in Nassau, with Margaret as witness and the crew of the Crimson Wraith in attendance. The ceremony was simple. A pirate captain married them on the deck of a ship, with the Caribbean sun setting behind them in glorious colors. But simplicity didn't diminish the meaning. When Nathaniel slipped a ring onto Ilara's finger, a gold band set with a single emerald from the Santa Maria's treasure, she knew she'd finally found her home. They used their share of the treasure to establish themselves. Margaret's expanded inn became a reality, with Ilara managing much of the business side. The Silver Mermaid grew into a true sanctuary, where women escaping abuse or servitude could find shelter, work, and a path to independence. Nathaniel continued to sail, but shorter voyages now, and never without coming home to Ilara and Thomas. The Crimson Wraith's reputation shifted, still feared by those who enslaved or abused, but known as a savior to those in need. On Thomas's first birthday, they stood on the beach outside Nassau, watching him toddle in the surf under Marcus's watchful eye. "Do you ever regret it?" Ilara asked, leaning against Nathaniel's side. "Giving up the treasure, settling down?" He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her close. "Regret having everything I never dared dream of, not for a single moment." He paused, then added softly, "I used to think I was the lonely reaper because I'd lost Catherine, but the truth is I was lonely because I'd lost myself. You helped me find that again." Ilara turned in his arms, rising on her toes to kiss him. "We found each other. That's what matters." That night, after Thomas was asleep and the household quiet, Nathaniel and Ilara stood on the balcony of their room above the Silver Mermaid, looking out at the moonlit harbour where the Crimson Wraith rested at anchor. "I've been thinking," Nathaniel said, his arms wrapped around Ilara from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, "about expanding the sanctuary. There are other islands, other ports where women and children need help." "A network," Ilara said thoughtfully. "Connected safe havens throughout the Caribbean." "Exactly. It would take years to establish, and it wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is." She turned in his arms to face him. "But we'd be doing it together. That makes all the difference." He smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his face, and kissed her forehead. "Together." Years later, when Thomas was old enough to understand, they told him the story of how his parents met. About auctions and storms, treasure and redemption, about choosing family rather than accepting what fate dealt you. "So you saved Mother," Thomas said, his young face serious. "No," Nathaniel corrected gently, glancing at Ilara, who smiled back at him. "We saved each other. That's what love does. It doesn't rescue, it partners. It doesn't fix, it supports. Your mother is the strongest person I know, Thomas. I just had the good fortune to be there when she needed someone by her side." By then, the network of sanctuaries had grown to 7 islands. The Crimson Wraith, under James's captaincy, patrolled the routes between them, ensuring safe passage for those travelling to start new lives. Marcus had trained a dozen surgeons in the art of childbirth and healing. Margaret had retired, leaving the Silver Mermaid in capable hands to live her final years in peace. And Nathaniel, the once lonely reaper, found himself surrounded by a family larger than he'd ever imagined. A wife who challenged and loved him in equal measure, a son who carried his name with pride, a network of women and children who'd found their own paths to freedom and happiness. On quiet evenings, he would sometimes take out Catherine's journal and read it, no longer with guilt, but with gratitude. She'd been his first lesson in compassion, in the cost of cruelty and the value of kindness. Her death had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. "Thank you," he would whisper to the memory of that kind young woman, "for teaching me that love is worth the risk, that some treasures are worth diving into the deepest waters to find." Then he would close the journal and return to his life, to Ilara's laugh as Thomas told some elaborate story, to the warmth of their home, to the sound of the sea that had given him both his greatest sorrows and his greatest joys. The lonely reaper was lonely no more. He'd found his safe harbour in the most unexpected place, not in any island or port, but in the hearts of those he loved and who loved him in return. And that treasure he knew would last forever.